Alright, as we continue on our Tremors journey, we go on to Tremors 4, which is called The Legend Begins, which I never really, put much thought into that. I just kind of saw another subtitle. So I wasn't expecting a prequel, from 100 years ago, which is a very interesting direction to go, because we talked about how do you keep a franchise like this fresh, and that was one of my big questions coming into it in the first place, was just how many times can you do the Tremors thing? But yeah, as we've been kind of introducing new variations on the creatures from 1 through 3, I guess this seems like a pretty natural way to go, and the whole idea that we were saying how the movies almost kind of have this Western vibe going on kind of underneath. And this seems to pretty much fully embrace the whole Western thing, going back to 1889, and where it almost might give you like a Back to the Future 3 vibe or something. Or when I was talking about Fear Street recently, and we went back to the 1600s, I had said it was sort of like the Army of Darkness of the whole franchise. Yeah, so it seems like we always end up back in time at some point, especially lately. So what's interesting about that is once we set that up, and it feels like they've kind of, it has more of like this sort of Western feel to it. But it's like, this was back when they were, first discovered. Are they as threatening? And before you even have time to ask that question, decapitation happens. So we start right away, which is great, and then we meet an ancestor of Bert, who naturally is also played by Michael Gross. And what's really fun about this is it basically feels like, it's half a Tremors movie and half just sort of watching Michael Gross have fun with his range, where we know the kind of character the Bird is, and how this character is basically the exact opposite. Hiram Gummer, I think his name is. And a lot of it feels at first like it's just going to be one of those usual plots where it's somebody just totally out of place, somebody that's in a place that's completely out of their element, and like in a situation where they're completely out of their element. And he's, as far as Bert constantly taking action and being the one that's kind of like on the front lines, you have this guy where he expects everyone to sort of do everything for him. It's like this sort of opposite Fresh Prince of Bel-Air scenario, where you bring the supposedly rich person, that's used to being waited on hand and foot and basically doing nothing for themselves and having no real abilities whatsoever or skills whatsoever, certainly nothing in survival, just sort of coming into this scenario surrounded by all these people, that are basically living by the means that they have. And there's some... At that point, it's basically like, alright, so we're still pretty much embracing the comedy aspect. And I know some people thought that the third one kind of bailed on the comedy too much. I didn't really get that vibe. But it seemed like this was kind of... They were going to kind of set up a certain scenario, to sort of bring that back in a way and bring back more of a... sort of a loose and comedic vibe to it, which, like I said, I don't really think that ever went away, but apparently that was some criticism that I saw. But this one is definitely gonna embrace that, and we get stuff like his interactions with the kid and stuff like that, about taking advantage and how that has a setup and a payoff that's nice. And just seeing in general, not just an ancestor of Berg being our main character, but all these people who are kind of the ancestors of the characters that we've met previously. Particularly the perfection characters, of course, which at this point was a town just called Rejection, and of course it's kind of nice as it goes on, and eventually at the end we get to see how the town actually got its name, which is nice. But as far as all these other characters, they are I don't know if they're as entertaining as their who would be their descendants. But there is something here with the interactions, and there's a fun quality to the characters, especially knowing the characters they kind of represent as far as their lineage. The Doc Holliday bit is quite funny. There's the whole callback, or would it be a call forward if it's a prequel? The old Fred thing, where we play up on our expectations of the death scene from the off-screen death scene from the first movie, where they find the head under the hat. where we still have the decapitation, but they throw a slight curveball when you're remembering that scene from the first movie, which is quite funny. And you can see kind of the sense of humor coming in and the playfulness of it kind of coming through and stuff like that. Um, but as far as us not having a Bert in this movie, because Hiram couldn't be more different than him, we do kind of have. We talked about the sort of Jaws connotations throughout this series. And Bert has basically kind of been the Quint of the Tremors series. And so, without a Bert type character, we do have a sort of Quint type that comes into this movie. That is Billy Drago, uh, who comes in and is like, even his death is very Quint-esque. But this whole idea of him being this character that is the one that's prepared in that way that we see Burr prepared in the future. But he may not be as prepared as we think. Like he sets himself up like he's going to be the ultimate badass, and he does the whole, shooting things to show how accurate he is. But then eventually, when push comes to shove, he gets his big fired up speech. And typically, this is the point in the movie where you would have the person that gives like the big, we're gonna rain hellfire down on them and this whole thing, and getting everything really pumped up for this big climax. And then he basically talks about raining hellfire on them, but then his response is maybe if we do that we'll get lucky. And you can see him kind of starting to lose his grasp a little bit, and that he's basically not the character that we thought he was, which is a really fun twist on that sort of character and that character type. Once again, somebody else that's the complete opposite of Bert, so we have to have... What's interesting about the concept of this movie is the whole idea of, depending on what, they accomplished, the typical feeling is like, you want to do your ancestors proud. But it's this reverse case now where it's like we want to see him turn to Bert, so it's almost like we're hoping that he makes his descendant ultimately proud. Hopefully Bert will look back on this dude and ultimately be proud of him, and so we want to see that sort of progression in this character to get to that point. And yeah, it's like the very last shot that Hiram does eventually sort of become Bert in a sense. But what's interesting about the progression of that and how much is put on that focus with the characters is there's surprisingly a little amount of action in this. A lot of it is sort of like the hunting aspect of it, which is really cool because, once again, there's that whole thing about just making everything feel fresh and making it feel like you're not just doing the same thing over again. And you would think it might be a bad call to not have as much action or as much, graboid killing as we would expect. Like I said, the whole idea of coming back and seeing it like at its most sort of, primitive, I guess you could say, and then having to build from that into what we know it as now, is like there's such a cohesion in these movies so far that I would have never expected. That's really nice. And I can really admire them just kind of wanting to change it up in general. Like, up to and including the setting, where I don't know that this is as, like, I don't know if it's the modern quality of the characters or what, but there is something that I really like about the first three, that it feels like something is missing here, and I don't think that sort of lack of action has anything to do with it, because I really like that whole idea of focusing on like just sort of the hunting part of it, and how they come up kind of sporadically rather than it just being this full-on action movie. Like I said, the fact that it kind of is giving the beginnings to where, like, if you were to watch this first in the timeline, it would make sense without it feeling like there's too much as far as like that you would have to know going in. Because these characters know nothing about what's happening, yeah. The fact though that it focuses that much on that character and the characters in general, but this character specifically, where we get to watch him have like a full arc. It's an arc that we can obviously see coming because we know Bert exists and he obviously got to that point somehow. But it is still a pretty fun ride to get there. Like I said, the way they're able to use those and be able to keep it fresh, without it just feeling like these movies are the same thing over and over again, I have to obviously praise the fact that they still haven't abandoned practical effects. It feels like there's a lot more of the practical in this one than there was in the last one, which is nice. Like I said, I'm into the whole ass blasters thing, which is a sentence I never really thought I would ever say in any context. Um, it's really nice to see all those practical effects and those real worms and actors actually getting on top of them and like physically attacking them and fighting them. That's the kind of thing that really brings the magic to these movies. And it's nice to see that they're not getting totally lost in the CGI. The CGI is getting more prominent, but I especially like the way they kind of took the approach. It's almost like the filmmaking approach matched the movie itself as far as going back to basics, and so having like all this practical stuff, all the practicality of them actually exploding and things getting on people. It's like that's the kind of thing you want in these kind of movies. Um, and the CGI has been used relatively sparingly up to this point compared to other things that just go all in on CGI, especially straight to video stuff. Um, but the fact that they seem to be using those straight to video budgets much to their advantage, and like not biting off more than they can chew. A lot of people, if they have a low budget, will write bigger than their means, and it just messes everything up and makes everything look terrible. So the fact that they're like, it appears that they have their budget in mind when they're writing, and like having the idea of how this will look and how they will pull it off when they're writing, um, is a big thing that a lot of people seem to overlook, and they kind of overshoot their budgets in the script process, and then just they're stuck doing all these things that are just really really subpar. But interestingly enough, it seems like the Tremors team is smarter than that. But like I've been saying, I heard that I think this is around the time the series was happening too, which I'll talk about the series after we've done all the movies. So we are coming up on 5, and I did hear, once again, I don't necessarily trust everything that I hear, because I do tend to differ from people quite a bit as well, but I have heard that 5 is when we kind of start declining a little bit. Now, I'm kind of afraid a part of that means more CGI, which I hope isn't the case, but once again, like I was saying at the beginning, I could see that happening eventually, especially if like the filmmaking team starts to change up a little bit. So I looked up the director of the 5th movie, and that's something we'll talk about when we talk about the 5th movie. But I could see, and Jamie Kennedy's there. I never really know how to how it's gonna go, as far as that's concerned. But we'll get there. But in the meantime, this is a nice addition. Like I said, I don't know if I'm as into it as the others, but I really admire all the steps they're taking to be as fresh as possible and do as much new things that they haven't done yet with the series, with this one. And like I said, how character focused it is really nice too. So yeah, so I'm okay with this one as well, but we'll see what 5 brings. So we're gonna talk about some more. We got some more verses coming, and we've got more reviews of new stuff and old stuff, some trilogies and all that other stuff. Through the rest of October, and then we'll see what's going to happen in November. But until then, I think that's it.